This is Cher, and I'm here with Jason and Rob. Guys, if you had to describe this podcast in 5 words or less, what would you say?
I'm going to go with Wile E. Coyote guzzling gasoline.
I'm thinking climate change, diarrhea, hurricane.
Are you serious? Maybe I should do this thing on my own.
Fine. It's a show about how to stay sane in a world where there's too many people consuming too much stuff and the planet can't take it anymore.
You had me at diarrhea.
Caution, if you're allergic to 4-letter words, you might want to try a different podcast. You guys ever go to the monuments in Washington, D.C.? They're awesome, right? You got the Washington Monument, Lincoln Memorial, all kinds of good stuff.
I only go to the Civil War Confederate heroes monuments.
I saw Lincoln at night. It was pretty spectacular.
Yeah, well, I got to tell you this quick story about a monument I saw in D.C. I was there for a conference on ecological economics and the environment, and we were, of course, having this meeting in the Ronald Reagan building because...
Yeah, ecological economics. The first person you think of is Ronald
Oh,
Reagan.
yeah, total environmentalist, right? Yeah. So it's actually an irony because the EPA is housed in that building.
Poor EPA.
But so in the main foyer where our conference, had the big gathering space, there's these two monuments, these big stone deals that are pinned up on the wall. One is just a relief of Ronald Reagan's head. It's kind of nice because just his head, maybe it got chopped off. But the other one is this quote of Ronald Reagan's, which was completely ironic given the conference that I was at. You want to know what this thing said?
Sure.
Well, let's hear it from Reagan's mouth. Here, play this clip.
There are no limits to growth and human progress when men and women are free to follow their dreams.
Okay, so repeat that for me.
He said, "There are no limits to growth and human progress when men and women are free to follow their dreams."
Oh, jeez. What a punch Ronnie in the mouth. I mean, that's just so stupid.
There are no limits.
No limits to growth.
Right.
None.
Right.
Zero.
Right. Well, I can think of a few, but I don't know. Is that what we're going to get into?
I'd like to. What can you think of? What do you got?
Oh, my goodness. Rabbits in Australia or whatever. I mean, come on. I mean, the world's full of problems when things grow too big. I used to teach an ecology class, right? And we would do this. I would do this simple exercise where I would have the students calculate how long it would take for a bacteria, humans or elephants to equal the mass of the Earth, given like their intrinsic rate of growth. This bacteria can divide every 20 or 30 minutes, and in a day or two or 3 or something, it hits the mass of the planet Earth. Just from doubling every 20 or 30 minutes.
Something must be limiting those bacteria.
Well, that's the thing, is that they always run into limits. But
there are no limits.
He's talking about humans, okay?
Right, we're exceptional. We're exceptional.
We're different.
We have brains.
I mean, I'm still growing.
Yeah,
I might not be growing the right way, but
I'm trying to shed a few pounds.
I think you might be confusing developing and growing. But let's talk about that a little bit. Like, what was Reagan talking about? He's talking about economic growth. And for our listeners out there, they might want to. We might all want to get on the same page of what that is. So what that means is, when your economy is growing every year, the gross domestic product, or GDP, is increasing in size. And that GDP is just a measure of the dollar value of all the goods and services that get produced in an economy. So, and it really boils down to how many people do you have and how much are they consuming. So if you're talking about growing the economy, you're either adding to the population or you're adding to the amount that each person consumes, or both.
Usually both. Yeah, right now.
That's what we've been doing.
Yeah.
We've been doing both, right?
And I should mention that economic growth, it's pitched as you want to grow a certain percentage every year. 3% is often what's thrown out there. So that means exponential growth, like your
well, divide 3 into 70, and that gives you the doubling time, right? So
right, let's stick on that for a sec, because that's not a commonly known thing. So that's the rule of thumb. You take 70
divided by the percentage, so 3%.
Of annual growth rate.
Yeah, so that was at 20-something, 22 years, 24 years, 3 into 70.
Yeah, something like 22 and a half years, maybe.
Okay, yeah.
To double.
Right.
So that means, okay, so if we had 3% growth every 20 plus years, the economy would double in size.
Right, which is incredible to think about. So imagine if we're trying to grow the world economy at 3% right now, add 23 years to what is it, was like 2040 or whatever. We have double the consumption of resources that we do now. I don't think that's even possible anymore.
Well, and then that's the problem with the whole exponential growth. 20 years beyond that, which is
it'd be four times. It'd be 4 times.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's insane. So,
well, we've had periods where growth has actually been much more than that. I mean, China has been growing at close to like 10%.
Yeah, for a clip,
which
right?
Is fucking crazy.
Well, that means that means they double their economy in 7 years.
Right.
Can you imagine living through that? I mean, people say China's nuts. They go to visit
my
China.
son is a little over 7, and he's grown more than twice the size in that period of time.
So there's
it's clearly achievable.
Well, there's an appropriate period of growth.
Thankfully, his exponential growth is going to slow down. Otherwise, he'd be like that guy, Robert Wadlow. You guys know him?
Oh, yeah. He was
Guinness Book of World Records. Yeah. Is he still the top
8'11",
tallest
that
guy?
8'11".
Is he still the record holder? Do you know?
He couldn't even dunk a basketball because he hit his elbow on it.
Right. Probably smash his forehead against the net,
Right.
I remember, I think every kid from our era was fascinated by the Guinness Book of World Records. And he was the page that you turned to first.
Yes.
It's just incredible to see this man who's 8'11".
Yeah. What were your other favorite pages?
I don't know, the two fat twins or whatever
The
on the
motorbikes.
motorcycles.
Yeah, dude with the massively long mustache.
The fingernails that were all curly, disgusting.
Up. Oh, those are sick.
Yeah, we all had the same favorite.
Of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger was in that version as like the most muscled man or something. Yeah.
Right. They do better now with all the steroids.
The man who took the most steroids.
Right. But getting back to Wadlow, like that guy, there was something wrong with his pituitary gland, right? And it's actually a really sad story because he was this really well-liked person and he was a celebrity, right? Because you can't not notice this guy.
Yeah.
And so he started actually touring with Barnum and Bailey or the circus, and he started going to parades and stuff. And he ended up dying really young at the age of 22 because he was in a parade and he used to wear leg braces, and one of them rubbed his ankle and he got a blister. And the blister went septic, and his heart just couldn't pump blood to his extremities well enough to heal stuff like that.
Right.
So, like you think about that, you get a blister and you die.
Right.
That's what happens when continuous growth is pushing the limits of the system.
Right.
And of course, now that we figured out what was causing that was a problem with the pituitary gland, that medically we stopped that growth so that this person could continue to develop rather than continue to grow.
Well, we wanted him to be tall enough that he could actually still make money off of his height.
Right? Yeah, like 7'1" was ideal, right, for its center.
Yeah, for basketball. Yeah,
right.
What I'm interested in thinking about a little bit is, where did this fixation on growth even come from, right? Like, have we always been trying to grow our economies and growing population? Have we always grown them? And if you sort of look back at the historical record, you sort of realize that it hasn't necessarily been the goal of society. And we've had periods of growth over time and then periods of contraction. It wasn't really until, the last relatively recent period in human history that we've just been growing and growing and growing. And it's amazing because it's like, it's so embedded in our consciousness, this idea of growth. I remember this. I remember there was this supposed scandal that happened, I don't know, a few years ago called ClimateGate. And they supposedly, there were some guys who were climate deniers and they hacked into the email of a climate scientist. And
I remember that.
And they basically, said they found this smoking gun where there were communications and the development of these scientific reports that they were writing where they claimed that they were sort of conflating the numbers, you know what I mean? And it was like, we gotcha. You guys are faking this thing. It was not real. And I remember Bill McKibben, who, he's a fellow at Post Carbon Institute, and one of the founders of 350.org, is really well known as a climate activist and writer. When that whole scandal happened, and the timing of it was such that it was done right before this, big international meeting to try to, get action on climate. And, he made this comment like, look, there's been so much climate science done, so much study done that you're going to find inconsistencies. You're going to find this stuff, because there are mounds and mounds and like piles of paper that could fill a room, right? So you could cherry pick whatever you want. And I was thinking about that because there is nothing. You go in a room that says we can grow the economy forever or population forever on this finite planet. You go in a room and there's like no data to support that at all, right?
Zero.
But we just walk around taking it for granted, like it's like gravity or some other physical law.
Well, and that's the problem, right? It's wishful thinking. I mean, you talked about going back in history. There was a time where growing the economy probably did help with progress, right? That you could have more people working together to solve some problem that we had, but it's not always the case. And we just ran with it. Like at some point in history, you said, okay, yeah, growth and progress seem to be going hand in hand. Therefore, growth forever must be the way to go. And
it's like your kid who's 7 or 8 can grow for a while. Growth and progress goes together. But at some point, it tapers off and they reach adulthood.
Right. But then you get these magical statements from the Reagans, right? There are no limits to growth. He sounds like a Disney character, right?
What's interesting is that if you think culturally, Reagan followed Carter, right? And what was going on with Carter, in that administration?
I mean, Carter was coming in. Well, first of all, Carter, I think, was coming in after a period of, I would say, maybe the pinnacle of environmental awareness sort of in this country. And he wasn't necessarily like the environmental president, although it was something that he was concerned about. But he was dealing with a lot of economic issues, and there was concern about energy shortages,
right.
And so he was, I think, trying to. You remember he reduced the speed limit on highways.
Right, never do that.
Fucker.
Oh my God!
Yeah, you want to guarantee yourself a short political career.
But he tried to speak very honestly about the situation.
Right. Yeah.
That was number one, though. Like, if you want to get booted out of office, just lower the speed limit and tell the truth.
Yeah. Right.
2 things you should never do.
Right. There's a reason none of us ever made it onto our student councils.
But you touched on this, Rob. Like, I think that our sort of economic thinking, or they call it dismal science. It's not a science, but the field of economics grew up and matured in a period where we actually had pretty remarkable growth.
Because of oil.
Right? Well, really, yeah. It's driven by energy and this abundance of like the short-term abundance of a supply of magical energy that we were able to harness and turn that into consumption of resources and get people to buy shit. And so you're born into that, just like someone is born into wealth and they feel like they earned it, like they're born into that. And
they think it's normal.
Sort of feel like that is normal, right? So it kind of makes sense that we might think, oh, well, not only has this worked so far, it's going to continue to work, sort of indefinitely in the future.
It pisses me off. It's like, okay, I think it's a problem of scale, like you're saying. During the development of economic theories, okay, which in the 19th and 20th century was Industrial Revolution time, tremendous growth potential because of fossil fuels. I kind of think of it as a trajectory. Like I remember watching like Mark McGwire hit a home run in Cardinal Stadium, right? The ball would go up for a while and then it would start coming down. But if all you did was extrapolate from the first, second off his bat, you would think there were no limits.
Yeah, that ball's still in orbit, isn't it?
Still in orbit. Yeah. But that's the thing.
It's out there with Elon Musk's car somewhere.
Yeah, in a whole big bag of steroids as well.
Exactly. But there's no perspective on that. There are physical laws related to a baseball in flight, and there are physical laws related to economy and its ability to grow. And they're just different scales of change.
Now you're just talking crazy. See. Where Reagan got a lot of this stuff from was from a business professor named Julian Simon.
Oh, gosh.
You guys remember that dude?
Oh, of course I remember Julian Simon.
Don't do this.
Whatever Simon says, we do.
This is going to hurt.
So he wrote this book called The Ultimate Resource. And of course, the ultimate resource is the vaunted human mind, because people never do anything stupid. We're just the greatest.
Well, remember Reagan said there are no limits to human innovation, right?
That's right. Well, yeah, growth and progress. So in this book that Julian Simon wrote, The Ultimate Resource, he had this quote where he said, "We have in our hands now, well, actually in our libraries, the technology to feed, clothe, and supply energy to an ever-growing population for the next 7 billion years." Now, I don't think he understood how big a billion was, but he later kind of retracted that and said, "Oh, no, I meant to say 7 million years."
Right.
So
did they ever take high school math?
I don't know, but but then the kind of humble physicist Albert Bartlett did a total takedown on Simon. He actually ran the math on growing the population at 1% a year over 7 million years.
Which, by the way, 1% a year would be a disappointment to most economists and politicians, right?
Yeah, so he did this way back in 1998, and with that much growth, you'd get a population of 2.3 times 10 raised to the power of 30,410, which is way bigger than the estimated number of atoms in the universe.
The universe is huge.
I mean, he said it would only take 17,000 years to get to the number of atoms in the universe, not 7 million, let alone 7 billion.
Right.
And this is the kind of stuff that Reagan based his.
Well, Julian Simon maybe wasn't so great on math, right? Like maybe.
But here's the thing, though. Here's the thing. These are the people who we elect, who we put in charge of policy. I mean, does anyone nowadays really have full faith and confidence in elected officials and policymakers? I mean, in 2018.
100%.
Oh,
They're
do.
always right. Yeah. What kind of question is that? Well, you don't have to be in 2018.
Of course.
You could be in the year 18.
Right. I don't know. That was a stupid question. I'm just flabbergasted by this.
Well, okay, so a little bit of a saving grace. There are some economists and other kinds of professors who actually took a physics class, who know something about energy, and they're actually saying we need to change. We need to prepare for a post-growth society.
Yeah, I mean, there's people doing it now. There was a recent meeting that happened in Brussels, right? Where there are 238 economists who all signed on to basically say
academics, not all.
They're not economists.
All of them. Some of them.
And they basically called for getting rid of GDP as a measurement of our well-being. Right? We need to track and measure different things. Pursuing GDP at all costs, GDP growth at all costs is destroying us and the planet.
I think one of them was Dan O'Neill, who Rob knows pretty well, wrote a book with him.
Yeah. Dan was I think he was the lead on that. And yeah, I worked real closely with Dan writing the book Enough is Enough. So, most of what I learned, I learned from him, because I don't know anything.
Well, I hate to be a cynic about this, but this is not new.
No.
And no offense, Rob, the book that you and Dan wrote wasn't necessarily completely virgin territory.
No. It was not. In fact, it was not at all our own thinking. We just rated stuff that's been around for a long time.
What came out in 1972? Does anyone remember?
I did. I came out of my mother's body in 1972.
That's enough.
We don't really want to hear about that.
Yeah. 1972, Limits to Growth.
Right.
So for those listening who aren't familiar with this, Limits to Growth was a study that was done by these MIT researchers. They were, contracted by a group called the Club of Rome to basically try to answer this question of if you sort of extrapolated the trajectory we're on, what would happen? And I think they actually developed the first computer model, at least that I'm aware of, and they kind of plugged in this data, looking at inputs like resources and population and pollution, and they sort of try to model out these different pathways of what would happen. And as the title explains, there are limits, right?
Yeah.
And even if they tweak certain things, you at a certain point run up against the limits of being able to continue to grow.
Right.
And in their standard run scenario, we're kind of tracking that.
Yeah.
They
updated it in 1992, and then I think there was another publication in 2004.
Yeah.
And in the last few years, another research group kind of like looked at it again and said,
Sure, yeah.
gosh, they're on this sort of business as usual trajectory that was done in 72.
Well, I think there are two things that are fascinating about it. I mean, one is that they were systems analysts. They actually looked at feedback. They looked at the connections between what was going on in the economy and what happens in the environment, which is something you don't get when you're in a standard economics course or all of your training as an economist.
You had a major in economics, right?
Yeah. I don't recall ever touching the limits to growth in any conversation. I don't know. Yeah, somehow I got past that. But
good job.
But the other thing that's amazing about it is the assassination job that was done on on the limits to growth, on the people that worked on it.
On Jimmy Carter?
Jimmy Carter. He was a proponent of what was in there. It was a very much an orchestrated. We got to take these people down so that we can keep growing the economy, because that's what what we're all about.
And I think we have to, be interesting to talk to people who kind of lived through that moment.
Yeah.
We were all born around that time,
yeah.
But we were still developing and growing, ourselves.
At that time, I said there were no limits.
Right. Yeah, that's what you said. Because you didn't want to have to go to bed, right? No. There are no limits.
Elmo told me.
There are no limits.
But, they, there's this period, right?
I like Elmo.
In the early 70s where, the environmental movement really, I think they learned from the civil rights movement. They stepped up and they were demanding action on protecting the environment, protecting watersheds and forests and all those things. And, the first Earth Day, right, was that 1970? I mean, they had like 10 million people marching in the street, which, I don't know what the population of the United States was at the time, but
it was 4 million.
It's pretty amazing. There's a lot of pollution created by all those 6 million people coming in to participate in the marching. But it was a significant percentage of the population. People were mobilized on this stuff, right? And then Limits of Growth comes out and Population Bomb comes out. There's a lot of conversation.
Yeah, Silent Spring was before that. That was huge.
There's a lot of conversation about sort of, hey, there actually are limits to us dumping our waste into our rivers and there's a real impact on the environment from our behavior. This is before I think climate change even was like
Nixon signed the EPA.
Yeah. Nixon in some ways was the most progressive. You actually look at policy that was
tons
passed.
of things came in around that time. Clean Water Act, the Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act. It was like the golden age of putting in check.
Right.
But then there's a reaction to that, right? So the reaction to that is attacking the authors of Limits of Growth. I remember I asked my dad, who was born in 1945. He was a baby boomer, part of that whole generation. And I asked him, had he ever heard of this thing? And I mentioned Club of Rome. He's like, oh, yeah, those guys, they were discredited.
I've heard that even from like academic biologists. If you haven't read it necessarily and you've just heard the story around it, you think, oh, I'm not going to bother with that. I mean, the propaganda is incredible. You read it and you go, yeah, no doubt, reasonable.
Right.
and yet there's an aura around it that was wrong. And that's what I find absolutely fascinating, that was able to create that.
And it's persisted, right? So it's fantastic that there's this group of academics, that are demanding thinking differently about what our economic goals are. Of course, it's in Europe, not necessarily here in the United States.
It's a much harder sell here in the good old U.S. of A.
But this is, 45 years after the publication of Limits of Growth, came out. And I don't know that we've gone much further, in terms of people's understanding or questioning of these things. And I think part of it is, and this is what Julian Simon was doing, and I think what Reagan was talking about. He was talking progress, but I think a lot of people point to human ingenuity or innovation. And they say that there aren't limits to that, right? And so we'll somehow figure out a way to deal with these physical limits. We're going to get more efficient. We're going to substitute resources. If we deplete one resource, we'll get another one.
Well, so the Limits of Growth modeled all of that. They said, what if we got more efficient? What if we substituted?
Right.
What if we had technical innovation that allowed us to do blah, blah, blah? Everything you're talking about, they thought about it in 1972, and they said, let's throw that into the computer model.
Even most environmentalists don't really understand the exponential
function.
function.
Right.
And so they think that substitution is totally achievable.
Well, what I think is going on is that, in some ways, that there's actually this structural lock-in and imperative for growth in the systems that we have in place, and somehow, and unless you can accept that there's a structural barrier and that you have to get around those somehow, you won't move past. And that's why I think these European folks are going to probably try to talk about.
Yeah.
But Rob, you're better at this. You wrote a book that dealt with this to some extent.
Well, so I think you're exactly right. Like, why would a Reagan or a Simon say, let's keep growing the economy forever? It's because the way we built the economy, the way it's structured, it relies on growth right now. So you would have to have an entirely different sort of economy that didn't need to grow in order to function. And so there's things about our economy that have to have that growth. One example is that all of our money is created as debt, which
with interest.
Yeah, basically banks issue money into the economy expecting to be paid more later.
Right. Principal and interest.
Right. So you have to have growth in order to have that money supply increase. There's other things too. There's this whole notion a lot of us have of we can get something for nothing. Like if I invest money in the stock market or I buy a house and I don't do anything to it, I can suddenly sell it for more a few years down the road.
Although retirement funds are depending on that exact issue right there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the psychology is so much I can get something for nothing. I think that it's the only avenue that people are offered for envisioning a retirement that is, you work your ass off for decades, right? Mm-hmm. And you don't necessarily get compensated well enough that if you saved and squirreled away your money without it growing, that you could live off of it, when you retired.
Well, that's a convenience, though, of those. You can keep wages down if people are expecting
that's exactly
they're
right.
going to be able to invest and save.
And that's a structural thing. It has to do with the fact that the wealth and wealth generation isn't distributed equally, right? So people can work a shitty job if they get the company sets up a 401k for them and they stick their money, or they have a pension. We don't have very many of those, but you stick your money in the market and you just wait. It's going to double every 7 years or whatever the hell.
But that's a structure of the economy right now that we're all invested in, right? Because if you put money into a mutual fund or stocks or some kind of retirement account and you're expecting that to grow exponentially, I mean, something like 8% a year averaged out is what the stock market has grown at. So,
well, they say, but if it's actually hasn't really performed that well, historically over the long term. But
I buy low and sell high, though.
You do?
Yeah.
Oh man, you got to teach me your tricks.
Yeah, I do the opposite.
You do not teach me your tricks.
Right. And I work for a nonprofit too.
Yeah, you're real smart.
Yeah.
Well, then I think there's legal stuff like if you're a corporate executive, right? You have legal imperatives for profit, and there's a lot of pressure from the public markets to keep expanding, to keep growing your share.
Exactly.
That's the only way you're going to get equity for people, because they think they're going to be able to grow that equity.
Right.
Well, and you can see how that plays out among corporations that were originally built for social purposes, or that had environmental or socially conscientious things built into their structure. Most of those companies end up getting bought. Ben and Jerry's got bought by Unilever, or Whole Foods, which was on a crazy growth path anyway, ends up getting bought by Amazon, right?
Right.
Sometimes, and if you're in the public market, you could just get a hostile takeover even.
Yeah. You know what my favorite was? That outfit, Burt's Bees, they were sort of like natural product. They got bought by Clorox.
That's a good
Those
one.
bees are now very sad.
Right.
Yeah.
They're chlorinated bees.
Yeah. Well, is there any penetration, like in terms of the context of policymakers and economists, politicians, to the idea that we can't keep growing the economy forever? Do you see? I mean, there's signs with these academics in Europe.
It's very fringe still. I mean, this is so. Let's talk about the mainstream again. We're going back to the mid '80s. The time of leg warmers and feathered hair.
Wonderful
with Reagan.
time. Wonderful time.
I get good memories of that.
Yeah. Well, don't start singing Cyndi Lauper songs, okay? But let's go fast forward to now, the head of the Secretary General of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, that's the OECD, one of the, kind of prestigious, along with the World Bank and your federal banks of the nations. This is one of your big...
The major developed nations in the world are members.
Yeah, and this is all about how do we progress or grow economically together, right? So the Secretary General of that group, the OECD, recently said, "We believe that it is possible to tackle climate change and grow the economy. Our bottom line is that green and growth are compatible. We can and must have them together."
Oh my God.
I like, first of all, that the guy says, our bottom line is. So there he goes with the financial spreadsheet analogy.
Well, I think the key word there is must, right? Yeah. He feels the must.
He feels the structural
He's
imperative.
hoping the can,
Yeah. Well, and you look, one side of that is green, meaning that we don't warm our climate to the point that we go extinct.
Right.
That's based on physics. That's how much CO2 and other greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere. There's nothing to say about that. It's
and by the way, there are limits to those things.
Yes. Well, the other side is we must have growth. Why? Because we want it.
Well, he's looking at he's looking at demographic information. Like there are so many people who are going to retire in this time frame, and they're going to require a pension system, and we're going to have replace of infrastructure as a government around the world. So we're going to require to have this much available to fix roads and bridges. And I mean, they're just looking at this. I mean, I think they're looking at these things saying, well, they don't have a clue of how to do it without growth is a problem.
Every institution needs it. I mean, the government needs it because they need increased revenues from taxes. And those increased taxes are only going to come from increased growth and income. Right?
Well, this is the point. Is that we've got to figure that out. Right. We've got to figure out how to have an economy that does not require growth. Because to say we have to have both green and growth is just fantasy.
It's fantasy. So the problem is then, if you're stuck on the growth, you can't actually think past it at all.
Yeah.
What I think it is actually taking Reagan's statement, right? Mm-hmm. And he said there are no limits to growth or human progress. Right. And if you actually split those apart, he conflated them. Right. And I think that that's been our general policy and our attitude for decades on end. And we've actually embedded that in our institutions. Right?
Well,
but if you split
except
those,
for RFK, who said we shouldn't be following GDP. Well, we know what happened to him.
He was an outlier, right? And he didn't last very long. So those two things have been conflated, progress and growth. Right, we see them as interchangeable, synonymous, mutually dependent, whatever you want to say. Right, and I actually think it's the opposite. At this point, despite whatever the OECD guy wants to say,
is it OECD or OCD?
Yeah, OCD. I'm obsessed about growth. Despite all that, we've actually hit the limits. We're seeing that, right?
Now.
We're seeing that. And in fact, if you look at economic growth, we've seen that it's taken an incredible amount of intervention into the economic system to try to grow it, and it's not been benefiting everybody, right?
Pushing on a string, they say.
That system itself is wobbly, right, at best. And then clearly the plan is trying to tell us, whoa, you're going to continue on this path, you're going to get bitch slapped pretty hard, right? And so I think it's because we've tied these two concepts together. Now, if we let them go and we said, actually, growth is the thing that's inhibiting our progress.
It is, right.
Just like, what's the 8'11" guy?
Robert
Wadlow.
Right.
Yeah.
Growth was inhibiting his progress, right? So if we could let that go, I know that sounds kumbaya because we actually have to take that attitude and actually make difficult structural changes to our institutions, our monetary policy, all these things as a result of that. But I think that's the mind shift that needs to happen.
That is clearly the first thing. I agree. That's the first thing that's got to happen is that let's let go of this. We must have growth. And then you can start looking at things to do. So there's this.
Then the innovation can take off. That's the crazy thing. I want people to be innovative
within limits,
within the context of these limits. And then let's see what can happen. But if you ignore those limits, then you're going to be an idiot.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to be innovative when you're dead.
I remember I heard about this study where they looked at behavior of children in terms of how they explored the world when if their backyard was fenced in or not fenced in.
Okay.
Right? So like maybe these were farm kids or whatever, and their backyard went out into farms. It's a little similar to your property here, Jason, where we are, right? But you actually have a fence.
Okay, thank you.
And what they found was that the kids who had a fence actually explored virtually the entire area of their backyard, no matter how big it was. The kids that didn't have a fence stuck really close to the back door.
Oh, that's weird.
Because for them, in a sense, having a boundary allowed them to feel like they could explore.
Oh, interesting.
And to your point, I think, Jason, that if we said, okay, well, let's try to be creative within these limits.
Right.
We've got to cap CO2 emissions. We've got to cap economic activity.
Right.
What do we do with that?
Right.
And it changes the ball game, and it does provide a huge opportunity for thinking more innovatively about how we tackle these things.
Yeah, and one opportunity that we already know a lot about is the whole issue of equality. So there was this economist, Henry Wallach. He lived from 1914 to 1988, and he was this real prominent economist, head of the U.S. Central Bank. He said, growth is a substitute for equality of income. So long as there is growth, there is hope, and that makes large income differentials tolerable. This gets back to what you were saying, Asher, about how, if you have growth, you don't have to pay people,
right.
So, well, guess what? The reverse is also true for that. If you have greater equality of income, that's a substitute for growth.
Yeah.
And it's a real positive way forward. One of these innovations we could really work toward if we agree that there are limits to growth.
Yeah. Any more?
Well, it makes me think of what you had said about Robert Kennedy, right? That was in 1968. You're saying, what was the quote? That GDP measures everything except that which is
makes life worthwhile,
right.
Or worth living.
Yeah. Right. And I would say, in terms of the things that we do need politicians that are going to be brave. They all obviously have to be educated about this thing because they've been steeped, like every student of economics that goes to university every year, in a mindset that's totally sending us in the wrong direction. But they also have to have courage to stand up and say, we're measuring the wrong things,
Well, that brings us right back to Carter and Reagan. Carter was a nuclear physicist and a peanut farmer.
Good boy.
So he certainly understood some things about science and some things about the way the natural world works. And what was Reagan? An actor. Exactly. He certainly understood make-believe.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, so we, I think, have a lot of, in a sense, power in terms of deciding who is going to represent us. And the other thing I would say to people is to consider, and this is really hard, right? Because we're all locked in the system too. So to tell people this is kind of like gulp. Think about what you're doing with your money.
Yeah.
If we need to shift this trajectory, maybe don't think about trying to maximize, your investments within the stock market. There are probably good reasons to be a little skeptical of that in any case in terms of protecting your assets. But why don't you put that money to work in a way that's going to provide you benefits long-term and immediate ones, that may not be monetary, but that put you in a position where you can actually progress and thrive and be happy in the future.
Either that or go on Amazon and buy as much plastic shit as you can. One of the two. I don't know.
Yeah,
you make the choice.
You'll definitely get a nice buzz when you get that box.
Right.
That's our show. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the podcast, and while you're at it, rate or review it at iTunes. That really helps get it in front of more people. To learn more, visit postcarbon.org/crazytown. And if you want to actually learn something instead of listening to us bozos, you should check out Post Carbon Institute's Think Resilience course. It's 4 hours, $20, and will seriously change the way you see the world. Catch you next time on the mean streets of Crazytown.
Hey, I want to thank a sponsor, and these guys have given us a lot of money because they have a lot. You know what I'm talking about, right?
I like money. No, who?
Finicon.
Oh,
Finicon. That's the financial advisors to financial advisors.
Yeah, it's very exclusive. So if you're not a financial advisor, then fuck off. There's nothing here for you. But what Finicon does is they combine the best of inside information with the best quants to make sure you're way ahead of your clients.
Right. So Finicon basically helps you get ahead of the game, and then you could shuffle bad investments to your clients.
Yeah.
Right. So you can make money. You get fees from your clients,
right,
while getting them to invest in bullshit stuff.
Correct.
Finicon helps you invest in real stuff.
Right.
Real stuff like pyramids.
Exactly. It's all one big pyramid, isn't it? And only the
don't tell
Finicon
anyone.
people know this.
All right. Well, thank you, Finicon. We appreciate it.